So after 7 live-action films, Netflix has brought us a new adaptation of Resident Evil. Does this TV series finally bring something that's going to make fans happy, or is this destined to be yet another divisive adaptation for the Resident Evil series? What's up everybody, and welcome to my review of the Netflix series Resident Evil. I was fortunate enough to be able to check out this season a few weeks early. As some of you may already know, Resident Evil is my favorite video game franchise. I have loved these games for years. I think that the characters and the stories are amongst the best in the survival horror genre, and while I have a lot of guilty pleasure with most of the live action films that we've gotten thus far, there hasn't been any live-action adaptation that I think matches the quality that this franchise deserves. And so while some things that were announced, like the casting of Lance Reddick as Wesker, really intrigued me, there was also some direction, some hints given about the story that really worried me, and I was eternally curious if this Netflix series was finally going to be able to crack the code and deliver something that appeals to new generations and new audiences while not alienating the diehard fans of this franchise. Starting off with the positives for Resident Evil, the main thing that intrigued me ended up being the thing that I enjoyed most about this show, and that is Lance Reddick's performance as Albert Wesker. I love this guy. I have always loved him, no matter what he's in, small role or big role. I was introduced to him back with the show Fringe, thought he was great in that. I love his smaller character in the John Wick universe. And despite the fact that the ignorant side of the internet lost their collective shit because it was a race swap, his gravitas, his dialect, his on-screen persona, I instantly saw that as a fit for Albert Wesker. And all throughout these 8 episodes, he was the character in the performance that continuously was great. I think he totally embodied the character of Wesker, both in ways that fans of this genre and fans of this series will like and appreciate and recognize, while also bringing some new flavors to the character that I think brings an interesting dynamic that we haven't seen from Wesker in any of the times we've seen him in the video games. And while they're not quite on Lance Reddick's level, I also thought that the two performances, basically the two central performances of young Billy and young Jade, the two daughters of Wesker, were very good as well, at least in the 2022 timeline. So they held their own. They were also among the characters in the show that I was most interested to check out their story and kept me intrigued with what was going on, kept me curious about what the next episode might hold. And since I've just mentioned it, I think that the way that they structured this show, having half of the timeline take place in 2022 and having the other half of the show take place in a future timeline that's like 14 years in the future, I think it brought an interesting dynamic to where both congruent storylines had intrigue, had questions that were raised, and had things that were eventually going to converge when these two timelines and two sets of characters meet again, that did keep me intrigued on how that was all going to play out. And I actually think that they do a pretty good job at respecting and keeping the lore of the video games intact. There's direct references and subtle references to it throughout the show, while at the same time not relying on them and not doing anything in the present tense story that would contradict or break canon with the events that we understand to be the past of this show. Essentially, the setup of the show is that you've got the 2022 timeline, that you have Wesker and his two daughters that move into New Raccoon City, which is this new civilization built upon the bones of the old Raccoon City, and of course you only have the government cover-up story about what happened to the old Raccoon City, while all of us that play the video games know exactly what happened. Essentially, the story of the first 3 Resident Evil games are very much hinted as being the canon background to this show. 14 years in the future, you have older Jade, one of Wesker's daughters, who is out there trying to survive in a completely desolate wasteland that has become Earth when eventually at some point that virus got right back out again. And so you have one timeline that's very much dealing with the sins of the past, the sins of the father, and these two daughters discovering what Umbrella is and who their father is, and trying to navigate themselves as 14-year-old girls in this world that they don't even really understand where they fit into all of it, and where they fit in their father's plan, and how much of their life that they've been told is actually true, And then in the future storyline is kind of your more typical post-apocalyptic zombie show that you get a lot more of your action, a lot more of your heightened sequences, a lot more of your monster designs coming out. And speaking of monsters, I think that most of the effects, both practical and digital in this show, were mostly successful. I think that like the Cerberus dogs and the Lickers look better than they have looked in the movies. There's some other creatures that I'm not going to talk about. There were certainly some interesting and unique designs that I have not seen in the Resident Evil franchise before that I thought looked pretty good. Even all the zombie effects, the makeup effects, the gore, everything like that I thought was mostly successful as well. And I like the fact that the zombies in this show are the faster zombies. They're the zombies that run. I know some of you purists out there like the mindless, slow zombies that are only dangerous in numbers. I have always maintained that to me, zombies aren't scary unless they are ferocious and animalistic like the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead or the 28 Days, 28 Weeks Later franchise. So I like the fact that we get those style zombies in this show. And finally, there's not a ton of it because they're very much more focused on their new storylines and their new characters and their new ideas than looking backwards. There is some cool fan service moments throughout the show, two in particular that I really thought was very well done, especially for fans of the video games. So despite the fact that the show certainly feels like it's distancing itself from the video games, there's moments where they very much have the fans in mind, and I think those moments especially is going to end up being some people's favorite moments in the entire series. Moving on to the mixed, and this is going to be kind of my overall thoughts of the show, is that while I certainly champion and I certainly recommend doing things new and doing things unique with a long-lasting franchise like this, a beloved franchise like this, I appreciate the fact that somebody loves the video games and loves the lore and loves the characters enough to try something different while trying to respect the past. I just don't think that's what fans want. I mean, it's been proved time and time again through all of the Paul W.S. Anderson movies, and even to an extent with the most recent Welcome to Raccoon City movie, that fans of this video game series, of which we are aplenty, just want a direct adaptation of the video game storyline. And so while I would probably go out on a limb and say that this is the most quality adaptation of the series in a live action format that we have gotten thus far, not a high bar, but I would say that it probably is, I still don't think it's going to win over the fan base. And there's still a large part of me that's frustrated that even though I enjoy a lot of aspects of this show, that we still have just not gotten a good, solid, respectful adaptation of the first games. If I was in Netflix and I had the money to throw around and I was in charge of signing the checks, my first thought if somebody brought up Resident Evil is absolutely, let's do an 8-episode miniseries or a season 1 just based off of the mansion, just based off of the stars and Albert Wesker and Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, and we can stretch that storyline out to 7 or 8 episodes and tell so many things that are directly out of the video games while also filling in some gaps and modernizing some things. Everything that Welcome to Raccoon City, despite all of the great things that it did, didn't take the time to do because they were trying to do 2 stories at once. And then if that's successful, guess what? Season 2, Raccoon City Police Department. Season 3, Nemesis. It's an idea that writes itself, and I can't fathom why nobody that has the power to sign these checks has not realized this yet. No disrespect whatsoever to the creators of this show, because I think they do a really good job with what they're trying to do. I just don't think the fan base wants that. We want a direct adaptation of these games, and I think despite how quality this is, most of the fans are going to look at this and go, yet again, they just don't get it. And me, myself, I'm very much in the middle. That's why this is mixed. There's a part of me that actually appreciates this show for doing something different, and I like the creativity of using the games as like a background story and as a foundation for this new story and these new characters. I think they do pretty well with that. But there's also a large part of me that's just like, for fuck's sake, can somebody just deliver what I want? Most of the fans of this video game series love it and hold it dear to their heart because of the characters, because of the story, because of the setting, and because of the emotions that we felt, the fear, the tension, the hesitation, all of that while we were playing these games back on the original PlayStation, or even playing the more modern remakes. It's about that experience, and that's what we want to be recreated in these live action formats. Not just, hey, look, isn't it cool to see the Lickers again? Yeah, it is, but we've seen that before. We want the stories, we want the characters, we want that heightened tension, we want that old school B-movie horror of creeping through the hallways and not knowing what's going to happen. That is what we want to experience again. Moving on to the negatives, kind of going along with what I was just saying, I don't think the show is very scary. This is certainly something that focuses more on the action and the excitement of some of the Resident Evil games, more so than the old school B-movie horror Resident Evil, especially in the future timeline. That is very much the big bombastic side of Resident Evil, where we've got a lot of action sequences, explosions, giant monsters, machine guns, huge kaiju style monsters, all that stuff. That is basically all for like the Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6 fans. And I think that even though there is some tense sequences, and even though they're going for some of that old school zombie horror with the 2022 storyline, I never really felt like there was a whole lot of tension. It was just cool to see some of these smaller scale creatures. I also didn't feel like narrative-wise, or certainly character dynamic-wise, that the future storyline had nearly as much going for it as the 2022 storyline. When you're focusing on Wesker and his two young daughters, there's a lot of family element there. There's a lot of drama that's just built into these two girls as sisters, and them navigating this teenage angst while having this larger-than-life situation kind of unfolding underneath them. That was really intriguing, and that was the sections of the show that I enjoyed the most, while the future storyline was very much kind of wash, rinse, repeat, post-apocalyptic zombie stuff. I mean, we've seen it done before in Walking Dead. We've seen it done before in the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. There was not really anything going on in a visual standpoint that was unique in the future storyline. And because we don't have the background to how adult Jade has met most of the characters that she interacts with in the future storyline, we're not as invested in her character dynamics or any of the drama or any of the situations that she gets into with these characters, because we're meeting them like it's an inside joke that we're on the outside of. We don't know who they are, we don't know what the history is, and so there's not really any investment from the viewer in this person's life or in this person's relationship with the adult Jade. And finally, I didn't feel that the season left off in a point that really had me excited or on the edge of my seat or intrigued for a season 2. I think that if they do get picked up for a season, I'll certainly watch it. There'll be a piece of me that wants to continue along this storyline, mostly the 2022 storyline, but there was nothing about the way that they left off, even the things that they teased for the fans, that really gets me pumped for where they might take this. And with the way that Netflix rolls most of the time with these shows that they try, it's a giant dice roll whether or not we're going to get a season 2 or not. So overall, guys, I was pleasantly surprised at the quality of acting and the quality of storytelling for most of this show. I was surprised at how well they were able to adapt the lore of the video games and pay respect to all of that, but I'm still very unsure about whether or not this is the Resident Evil adaptation that we want or the one that we need. Well, that's it for me, guys. If you guys want to check out the rest of my reviews in the Resident Evil series, I'll have the movie reviews down here, and I will have all of my coverage of the video games in this playlist up here. So please check that out, like and share this video, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.